My father spent a good portion of his career with a tape deck slung over his shoulder, a slender, stubby microphone nosing into his pocket like a dog looking for a treat. Walking along, driving along, there was no telling when he would stop, look up, not at anything specific, slowly turn the microphone on, and press record. Horns, airplanes, footsteps, tires beating through wet leaves, the breathing of someone hiking in snow, trombone lessons from a block away, a hot air balloon when the flame is first lit. And voices, 1, 2, male, female, 3 in a street corner, 20 in a small room, hundreds in a theater, and crying and laughing and cursing and shouting, and screams. My father was really good at screams. It was a good thing to be good at. Footsteps in snow might come and go, but there was a steady market for screams. You're shooting a war film, a horror film, a romantic film. There's a plane crash, a bomb explodes, someone jumps out of a cake. In the background you hear a scream, or screams, if the director is a big spender. Those aren't always the screams of actors. Do you know what it costs to have an extras are so much cheaper when they're silent? Those screams in the background, and sometimes even the screams seemingly coming out of a star's mouth, those screams were often my father's doing. He collected, marketed, and rented them singly and by the dozen for decades. Just last year he sold his archive to a competitor, and though my father complained that the lump sum was hardly equal to the years of future royalties he was giving up, he made out just fine. In fact, the amount he got was surprisingly large, given that a lot of his screams had aged. It wasn't that the sound quality was poor, just the discerning ear could tell they were from a different era. Smokers, for example. There is not as much call for a smoker scream as there once was. Or a man with a hat. My father always insisted that a man with a hat screamed differently than a fellow without, but that was my father. He tried to demonstrate once when I was home from college. He gave a little scream, a yelp really, and told me to pay attention. He picked up a hat from the closet, an old fedora I had never seen him wear. He put it on and yelped again. "See?" he said, although he was asking if I had heard. "No," I said. "It sounds the same." He took off the hat, yelped again, put it back on, yelped more. "See?" My father's demeanor always veered between mad scientist and elementary school teacher, frenzied genius alternating with patronizing patience. I shook my head again. I had long learned the best way to annoy my father was to limit myself to soundless gestures. "Well," he said, upset. He took the hat off and on, yelping all the while, more to himself as he went on. Finally, it came to him, "No, of course it doesn't sound any different. I don't sound like a man with a hat screaming because I don't wear hats. It doesn't matter if I just stick one on, I still sound like a bareheaded man." He went to put the hat away. "Did my mother wear a hat?" I said. "No," he said, but he did not turn around. "Do you think her scream would sound differently if she had?" I asked. Now he turned. "No," he said quietly, and balanced the brim of the hat in his hands. I never knew my mother. I don't remember the day my father told me that she had died long, long ago. Her absence simply was and always had been. Did I miss her? I suppose. In a way, I didn't know what a mother was. Not really. I knew other kids had one, but I didn't. I never knew my mother, but one strange night before leaving for college, I came to know her scream, and then the world did. It was an unusual sequence of events, but my mother's scream was unusual for many reasons, the biggest being that late in his career it became my father's biggest seller. It wasn't a classic scream. It didn't start with that oral punch, hold the note, and finally fade like a train heading off a bridge. No, hers came in 3 syllables. Ha! There's no way you're going to figure out what that sounds like, but make the A sound like the one in hat, not paw. Bite the last piece off too soon. Make it the least bit musical, a little breathless like you've been socked, and be thinking that the next sound out of your mouth is going to be a laugh. No, exactly. It makes no sense, especially the laugh part, but trust me, it's all there. I've heard it 100, maybe 1,000 times. It's called the Brenda, by the way. Not my mother's name, not anyone's, as far as I know. There were years when I would hear it pop up in a film and I would nudge my date to tell her about it later, but the results were always disastrous. I was slow to realize that admitting I was related to that scream was like admitting I was related to someone who'd been executed, something horrific that became unspeakable as soon as it became personal. Because it was a horrible scream. It was short, but it was scary, and the hint of a laugh made it even scarier. You would imagine it would get lost in the background, but it never did. You're thinking it's just because I knew it that I always heard it, but you could have asked anyone who was in the theater on a night my mother screamed. You left shaken, even if you didn't know why. It was a background scream, but it was better as a background scream. Front and center, it was too much. I've seen it dubbed into one or two actresses' mouths, and it is too awful, disturbing, and unbelievable. Better to have it happen off stage, in the distance, a sound you sometimes didn't know you were hearing, a sound you never really heard until you yourself were walking alone one night down some dark, wet, deserted street when suddenly the streetlight shudders out from a hidden doorway moving as fast as if he's falling. Did you gasp? Just a little bit? Good. That sound, that's part of it. People paid my father for his screams, and he in turn paid people much less for theirs. In his early years, he relied mostly on drama students from NYU or some of the private acting schools around Manhattan. Students would scream until they were hoarse again and again as my father pressed them for something they could never quite give him. He called it an ounce of real. The closest he ever came with a student was when she screamed at him on the way out. He had given her $10 for half an hour of operatic shrieking, and she was almost in tears. Not because of the money, nor because her voice was almost gone, but because of the noise, the noise, the noise. She felt as if she were going mad, and she screamed. As the door to the studio shut soundlessly behind her, my father raced back to see if the tape was still rolling. It was. He ran after her with another $5, but she wouldn't take it. She screamed again. Not as good, if you want to know the truth, my father later observed, and fled. Her scream became the Sally, and my father made decent money off it. It was a solid workhorse scream, the kind you reach for when the person off screen is getting murdered and shouts less from fear than fury. It was after her that my father turned to civilians, as he called them, for his screams. Now, he didn't do live screams. That is, he never recorded anyone who was actually in trouble. You could never count on that kind of luck anyway, he said. No, he put an ad in the paper, something like, "I'll pay to hear your voice." Time and an address, and wait to see who showed. He toyed with ideas of how he would get good screams out of people. Should he scare them, show them terrible pictures, movie clips? But the truth is, my father did not have it in him to scare people. He was always listening for a new sound. And when he wasn't listening, he was taping. The result was that he spoke and emoted very little. Like every boy, I have a Little League story. Except mine is not of a father yelling or even getting in the way of the action with a camera. When I rounded third after my home run, I saw my father in the stands, absolutely still, holding his microphone to the crowd. So when those first civilians did show up for taping, my father did nothing more than simply ask them to scream. Among the ones who stayed, a pattern emerged. First scream, they giggled. Second scream, their voice gave out too soon. It takes more air than you think. And the third scream, you started making money as soon as they opened their mouths. Fourth, fifth, sixth scream, until they couldn't go on. The worst of the lot was 10 times better than the best drama student. My father had theories. At a certain point, he thought the brain stops second-guessing what's being asked to the vocal cords. If I'm screaming, there must be a reason, the mind figures, and the person just surrenders to it. Now, a good actor, a great actor, might be able to will that emotion into being, but for variety and price, you couldn't beat the strangers my father found. Their screams became the Tommy, the Bertie, the Carol, the Betty Ann, hell, Lou, Francis with an I, Francis with an E, Johnny, Cindy, Todd, Mr. Tams, and Hazel, sweet Jesus, I hope I never hear another Hazel. There were dozens. I once asked him where he got all the names and why he used the names of people. Why not use numbers? Would you buy a Corvette if it was named the 847908, he said, shaking his head. I was only 9 at the time. I was too young to buy a Corvette, and too young to know that my father was shaking his head not because I had asked the question, but because he thought I was the type who would, in fact, buy a car that had a number for a name. And I did buy a Mazda 626, but that is not my father's point. I would say a third to half my childhood conversations with my dad ended this way, with him shaking his head and looking at me sadly. Another variation, him shaking his head and saying, "You sound just like your mother, God rest her soul." It was in this way that my mother lived with us and through these apologetic benedictions, through photographs and, of course, on tape. Not her scream, not that tape, not yet. Just the tapes of everyday sound, of her, of them, at home doing whatever they did before I came along. Sometimes it seemed like he had left the tape recorder on for an entire afternoon or evening. You could hear a vacuum going or birds outside singing, maybe a radio in another room, the clatter of the dishes in the kitchen, and then steps. "That's your mother," my father would always say. I would sometimes want to ask a question, but he would shush me and close his eyes. He always considered listening, even at the movies, to be too important a task to let vision distract. So I would close my eyes too. They had lived where we lived, in an old row house, a wonderful place for sound, hardwood floors throughout, steam heat, rickety stairs, and out back on the other side of the alley, a Chinese cemetery that every animal on the island visited each night, yipping and snarling while they devoured the meals people left for deceased relatives. Stairs, steam, animals keening in cemeteries. To think about it now, it's amazing that I could have heard my mother at all above the din, but there she was, walking to and fro across the invisible room before an invisible microphone placed there by my invisible father. Step, 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 step. God, those steps, that sound. That is childhood to me, the way others hold as their touchstones, the color of the ocean in a particular picture book, the smell of a Christmas tree, the taste of sunflower seeds, or salt from the sea. "Listen," my father said, "there's something I need to tell you about your mother's scream." And that's where I usually stop, but Nick told me to go on. Those tapes, like the fact of my mother's death, always were. I don't remember when my father started playing them, how he first introduced those tapes to my mother, how I first reacted. I do remember when he stopped playing them for me. I was 14 and had a friend over. I had told him about the tapes and he wanted to hear them. I wanted him to hear them too. My father was horrified. My friend didn't know that, but I knew the various grades of my father's silences, and I knew he was displeased. It wasn't until later that evening, after the shrugging friend had wandered home alone, that my father sat me down and explained we could never play the tapes for anyone of my mother, not friends, not even family, and we had little that passed for family. An aunt on my father's side who sent unsigned Christmas cards, no one on my mother's side. These tapes were private, and people would not understand. I didn't realize it until right at that moment, and maybe not until fully years later. Of course they wouldn't understand. A widower and his only son, listening to tapes of the departed wife and mother. But what really pained me, and this is what took him a lot longer to explain, was that the tapes themselves were odd. Because for all the normal household noise my mother made, she never spoke. Not a word. Sometimes when she was in the kitchen and you could triangulate locations by sound, dishes plus water plus faraway footsteps, you could hear humming, but only very faintly, and occasionally a voice, but that would turn out to be a scrap of a radio program she was listening to. Like I said, this did not seem odd to me until my father suggested that other people would not understand. It wasn't that I had never wondered about this before, but then the answer seemed obvious. My mother never spoke because my father was taping. He was a sound engineer, after all. She wasn't going to spoil his tape. When he left that tape recording going for hours at a stretch at home, he was trying to collect the background sounds of a house, he once explained. You couldn't have people talking in the background. That would make the tape less attractive to a movie director. Footsteps were fine, anonymous for the most part, but if a director wanted voices, he would prefer to add them himself. Men, women, kids, his top-billed star, some character actor. He didn't want to have my father's wife in the background chattering or screaming. Blurry photographs, muffled tapes. Believe it or not, and thinking back, I sometimes do not. It took me until I was through high school to decide that my father was making my mother up, that the image, indistinct though it was as complete a fiction as the movies my father contributed to. But why? That's almost too big a question for me now. It certainly was too much for me at the time. It was bad enough to be missing a mother, bad enough to have a father whose own reserve exacerbated her absence. To be also the victim of a grotesque hoax was beyond consideration. But I had to know, or I had to let him know what I didn't know, which I did, not by confronting him directly, but by picking at him with question after question. Why did he only have footsteps, not her voice? Why didn't he have photographs? Why were the ones we did have so indistinct, so different? Where was Mom buried? Why didn't we visit? Why wasn't there anyone else I could ask these questions of? I come to my own conclusion, a romantic one, which was that I was adopted, that my father had no idea who my mother was, that my father, a single man, had adopted me only because he was lonely, only to realize that his loneliness was indelible and only deepened by adopting an orphan. No wonder he specialized in screams. My father parried these questions as he had done for years with much the same answers he had always given. I was gratified to see my renewed, vindictive teenage persistence winnow away at his humor and patience. We both knew that he would crack soon. I assumed it would be before I left for college for good, and this turned out to be correct. It was my last night at home. We had gone out to dinner, an uncharacteristic event. He'd had 3 glasses of wine, also uncharacteristic but promising, I thought. When we returned home, he got out the tape deck and set it up to the little dining room table, the microphone aimed at me. Then, to my weary dismay, he went to fetch the Memory Master. This was a reel onto which my father had dubbed my life up until that point, my early babblings, toddler rantings, a snippet or two of its spelling bee I had lost, the crowd after that home run, my name announced at graduation. It was also on the reel. This was also the reel on which were preserved some of my mother's ghostly footsteps and the rest of her silent life. I'd long before come to think the tape extremely corny, but my father placed a great value on it, keeping it under lock and key, which I cynically assumed was meant to impress me, though it no longer did. Once he had threaded the tape through the reel and cued it, the ceremony mattered to him. He would never have survived in this digital world, where recording can begin with nothing other than a finger's soundless tap. He told me to say a few things about what was going on, how I felt about going to college, what I was hoping to do, what I was going to do after I graduated. I complied as listlessly as I could. Maybe it was my disregard for the occasion, maybe it was the niggling assault I had subjected him, maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was something he'd planned all along. But after I finished, he pressed stop and looked at the machine. There's something I never played for you, he said. He rewound the tape. There's no way to introduce this, he said. He fell silent as we both watched the tape diminish on one reel and grow on the other. Finally, the tape ran clear. We reached the lead, and he had stopped. This is your mother, he said, and he pressed play. My mother was crying, and because I was a professional son, my first thought that she was doing an awful job of it, snorkeling her way through a kind of oily blubbering. I looked over and saw my father crying inaudibly, which made me tear up and then grow angry. Angry at my mother for making my father cry, angry with myself for doubting him this whole time, because this was not an ounce of reality, but the full weight of it. This was no actress, no stranger, but my mother. The crying was that off-key, that intimate, that consuming. It was a tiny sound, but it filled the room, and it was time, past time, to turn it off. He was shaking his head. I reached out to press stop. Then came the scream. It was my mother's scream, the whole eerie, penetrating terror of it, anguished and exhausted and even foolish. And then it was quiet. Not blank tape, just taped silence. My father looked up, drew a breath, and I stopped the tape. He stared at the machine for a minute, a full, quiet minute, and during that time I stared at him. He was white and sweating. For the first time, I realized he was old. Your mother, he started to say, but I cut him off. I'm sorry, I said. I'm sorry, I kept asking. But why was she crying? And what was that scream? He shook his head slowly. When I met your mother, she was just starting out, an actress. My father was not a whistler, but if he had been, he would have been the next morning. He greeted me with a full breakfast, delighted in making such a small ritual, serving me my first cup of coffee, welcome to adulthood, and talked about me going off for college. We talked about the tape. The tape, of course, was awful. My mother had done it as a practice for him. She wanted to surprise him, say that she was as good as the others he was taping. And it was poignant and cute, perhaps, but that's why it was so terrible. They had a laugh about it, he said. The whole thing was a lark. He drew a deep breath. We reached the train station and parked. He was staring out the window, his hands on the wheel. He never played the tape before, he said, because it made him too sad. The fake tears, the giggle scream. He should have played it for me earlier. That's not bad, I said. Well, the crying is bad. My father winced and then waited before I went on. What was I going to say? I didn't really know how to speak to my father about my mother, about love, about anything, but the technique, the business of sound, I became aware that could be, always was a refuge, a place for us to meet. She sounds like a fat man crying. A professional little laugh. But the scream is different. It's unique. I bet you could do something with it. I tried to use shop talk to get us through it. Wouldn't that be a better memorial, I said, to get her finally into the movies where she always wanted to be? My father's eyes glazed with tears. He started to smile. When it finally came time to run for the train, he pulled me back in a kind of clutch or hug. An irony of my exposure to my father's work is that real screams always sound artificial to me. As once at a hockey game right down next to the ice, when a player suffered a tendon torn in two. There could not have been anything more authentic than his screaming, and the crowd went silent. But all I could hear was his imperfections. He wasn't taking big enough breaths. The scream was petering out too quickly, the tone too unsteady. Nothing wrong with an unusual scream, but the hockey player sounded like an amateur. So too my father, the last time I saw him. Actually, I heard him before I saw him. I was outside the door. I was getting briefed by a nurse. "It's not too late," the nurse said. But it was. So much has fallen so silent, my father despaired at his retirement. Take offices, take almost anything. Typewriters made music. Typing on a touchscreen makes no noise at all. He despised the word earbuds. And screams. Once upon a time, my father said you could find within a scream the DNA of that world's entire moment, its fears and ambitions and strangely exuberant, apparently widespread belief that if you raised your voice high enough, you would be heard. The sound came again from him as I entered the room, and now I could see it, a hiss, a hum, something sharp freed from something deeper. It had shape and color and volume, everything his own face and form no longer had. "Dad," I said. His eyes were closed. Machines all around sucked and beeped and clicked. "Can you hear me?" I said. Thank you.